Okay, so I we're gonna repeat a few things a few times because I think they're important. So let's jump in. Where are we? So basically, tenders and quotes and stuff they're all sort of family of, they're part of like revenue generation. We've covered sort of putting bids in for funding quite extensively, and there's a lot of learnings that carry over into the tendering space, especially the more formal tendering stuff. So there's, just to get through a few sort of definitions. Basically, a tender that's put out is a sort of a formal request by an entity, and that could be in the private or public sector, or sort of answering a need that they have, and it's a formal. It's a range of levels of formality, but it's basically a formal request to supply a service or a product to a certain set of specifications. And a tender brief is normally sort of an invitation to pitch for it, basically. So then there's a few different types of tenders, and a lot of the terminology that I use might also change a bit from region to region and country to country. Later on, we'll talk a bit about requirements and stuff. But like with funding bids, these things are sort of general guidelines, but there's always slight nuances depending on local, either the first people that put out the tender, or like, from country to country, legal and compliance and so forth. But basically, an open bid is sort of normally the type of tender that a government institution or something like a government institution would put out. It is normally published openly, and it's open for anybody to tender. It's open mainly for transparency and for accountability. It's the type of thing that will be published in government gazettes or stuff like that, where you basically anybody can see what's going on and who's bidding for it and so forth. Then closed tenders are often a little bit more targeted, where an entity might have a preferred suppliers list, or know that they want to only speak to a certain industry that can supply what they need. It's no sense, and if you want to put up a wind farm, to go speak to the shipping industry or to, whatever. It's normally a more targeted, closed bidding process. But what would happen is you'd still end up with numerous people putting in proposals to the brief and to try and win the contract. But it's normally not as open and transparent as I've found. Mainly those would come from companies rather than sort of public or government institutions or NGOs and stuff, that have a lot more accountability outside their organization. Like often companies will just put a targeted close bid. The thing is, I'll talk to it a bit later in terms of format and just the volume of bids that are received by these institutions. Obviously, sometimes a targeted or sort of a closed tender is put out to limit the number of random tenders that come in. And then an RFQ, or request for quote, it's often, especially as a small business, where most of us will encounter a sort of a tender or a request for a quote, we, you know, a client that you already have, or, you know, there'll be a publication, somebody would ask directly for your services and basically say, I need 500 of these widgets 3D printed. Please quote me. I need it in a month, and they need to be blue. And it's sort of more of a direct request for a quote, often called an RFQ. But a lot of these terminologies might slightly vary. It's normally for smaller projects, smaller scope, and so forth. Like I say, yeah, basically where you'll be asked directly for quotation because you either provide a niche service, or you've got a relationship, or with the person wanting the quote.